Okay, we've got two top loading kilns, both made by pot clays, and both are controlled by programmable controllers which are attached to the wall next to them. They're basically made up of heater elements inside an insulated container. Alright, in the big kiln, some of the elements sometimes sag and try and get out of the grooves. Some of the grooves are damaged, which is supposed to hold them in place. So what we need to do occasionally is just check that they're all okay, and if they are starting to sag or there's no groove left, pop little bits of bent, broken element to act as clips. Okay, and that will stop them popping out. Eventually they get very worn and very oxidised, and they will need to be replaced. In the bottom of the kiln we've got a bat with a kiln shelf and some supports, and in the big kiln what I tend to do, because it's fairly uneven temperature relatively, is I'll put some fairly tall supports in the bottom to try and give a bit more heat from more elements for the bottom part of the kiln than for the top. If we have a look at the smaller one, basically the same idea, not as badly damaged, even though both kilns are getting on and are quite old. They do work. Both kilns have a lid that lifts. Now on the smaller one there is a safety switch attached to the box here, so that when the lid is put down, the handle is turned and that engages with a switch inside, which allows the voltage to run through into the elements. Now the big kiln has no such safety switch, so whenever it's on it is actually live inside. I mean, as a matter of course, you don't open kilns when they're switched on, no matter what, okay, because they're either live or very, very hot. When it comes to loading the kiln up, you really got to try and assess how much work you've got for each kiln. So if I look at the work on the glaze firing shelves, there's not a great deal. Looking at some of it, maybe it shouldn't be here either, so I need to check that some of it is definitely glazed. Sometimes people put them in the wrong places, and I'm looking for biggish items as well to try and decide whether they would go in the smaller kiln or not. Now looking at this, we've got some jewellery and bits and pieces lower down, which I'm not actually going to fire because those wires will bend in the heat and everything's going to stick together. So having a look at what there is for biscuit firing, there's quite a bit more there, so I reckon I'm going to do the big kiln with a biscuit fire and the small kiln with a glaze fire. Have to make sure that all the pots are really, really dry. Check them by picking them up, have a look underneath, see if you can see any damp spots. You can usually tell by the feel as well whether there's any dampness left in them. If you're not quite sure, then the best thing to do is not to fire them and leave them a little bit longer to dry out. If for some reason you're being a little bit pushed, it is possible to put the kiln on at a low temperature just to dry the last part of the moisture out of the pot, and then turn it on for a biscuit fire. When you're loading a kiln for a biscuit fire, you don't have to worry about pots sticking to each other. There's nothing on the outside that's actually going to melt. They're going to dry out and they're going to fire up to about 980 degrees, which is going to make them hard, easy to handle, porous enough to suck a glaze onto the surface, but there's nothing on there that should melt and stick. So you can pile things up a little bit. What I'm going to do with the work that I've got here is to measure it. I've got in the bottom of this kiln kiln supports that are 8 inches tall. So what I'm going to try and do is put things in that are going to fit nice and comfy into that 8 inches lower down, and then stack things around them basically. Okay, so looking at the pots on the shelf here, we've got some cottages. The smaller one will go in without being turned onto its side, because the other thing you can do with biscuitware is you can turn it onto its side, because you're not having to put the unglazed portion down onto the kiln shelf. Give them a little bit of space in between. You've got to get air to circulate, but as long as it's not too overly packed, it's possible to do a nice slow biscuit fire with quite a lot of pots in place. If you've got bowls, you can always put things inside them. You don't have to have the bowl with the opening upwards, again you can turn it over, so you can stack smaller bowls as well inside bigger bowls. And then around the outside of that, if you've got things like tiles, you can stack those up. Anything that is quite a bit taller, I tend to leave to go in the top of the kiln and just make sure I've got enough room for the tall thing when I put the last shelf in. Be careful handling dry clay. It's got very little strength, so you don't want to pick something up by handle if it's got a handle on it. You need to get hold of the body and make sure it's well supported. Particularly smoother clays tend to have less grit or grog in them, and they've got even less dry strength. So something like porcelain, if it's really thin, it can be almost impossible to pick up under its own weight because it will just break. So you've got to be really careful with those. What I'm going to do is carry on loading this kiln now and then show a little bit of what's inside it. Things that have got slip on them, again there's no need to worry about those melting and sticking. Slick as a liquid clay, so it won't melt at 980. What we've got in the kiln at the moment is a selection of pots. You can see some are stacked inside others and some are resting on top of others. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to fill this up in a minute with some tiles that somebody's brought in. We've got hundreds of tiles to do and part way through, about halfway through, but I can slot the tiles around things. If in the case of small things like, let's just show you this teddy bear or this clay bear, if that arm fell off for some reason, if it had not been put on properly, it had not been scratched and slipped properly, it is possible at this stage to put things back on. So all you would need to do is wet down the area, put some fresh slip on it, and there's a fair chance that that's going to stay there. Other things like bowls, unfortunately if you do knock the corner out of a bowl or the edge off a rim, then it is very difficult to fix that. You've got to be really careful putting things in, you've got to be really gentle putting them down, and making sure you don't bang things into each other. Unfortunately it will happen, and it's all part of the game, I'm afraid. Now you can see the bottom layer with some of the tiles added to it. I try not to stack them absolutely one on top of another because you do want air to circulate around the kiln as best you can. But that's the bottom layer done. Now I've noticed on the shelf there's quite a few flat items as well, so what I'll perhaps do is a lower shelf with a smaller gap on top of this, and then build things up with whatever's left. When you're putting a kiln shelf in, be careful, they're fairly heavy. You've got to lift it over there and carefully drop it down, making sure that everything that you've put in on the bottom layer, or the layer below it, finishes way below the height of the support. The other thing you've got to watch out for, on the far side of the kiln here, actually on the near side of the other one, there is protruding into the kiln the thermocouple. That's got a ceramic casing around it, and you really want to make sure you don't knock that because it will break fairly easily. And the other thing is, when you're putting the shelves in, you want to make sure that the thermocouple is between shelves as well. What you don't want it to be either is really next to something big that's going to hold on to its heat too much, because you want the thermocouple to register the air temperature in the kiln rather than the temperature of the biggest thing that's right next to it. Okay, each time you put a new shelf in, you need supports underneath it. I've partly filled this shelf up. What I'm going to do is place the supports now, so that as I'm filling the rest of it in, I'm not going to put them where I want the supports to be. I'm putting slightly taller supports in than I really need in this case, because I'm going to fill it up with some smaller pieces again on top. The way these have been made, they're fairly robust. I can overlap them a little bit, and I still want some air above it to let the heat circulate and let any moisture out. So I've partially done it. I'm going to come back to that in a second and show you what it looks like when it's full. Okay, I'm going to call that shelf full. What I've just noticed is on the shelf ready to go in, there's some taller items which I've measured to be about 12 inches tall. So I just need to check if they were going to go in stood upright, whether I could get those in or not. So allowing a little bit for another shelf, thickness of another shelf, I could just about do that. I don't really like getting stuff right to the top of the kiln. I'd rather it was lower down, but occasionally if it's an odd piece and it's not really crammed up there, then I will do it, particularly at biscuit fire, because the temperature isn't critical. It's not going to spoil the finish if it doesn't heat up or if it overheats. So what I'm going to do is put another shelf on top of that, just making sure that everything is below the height of the supports. But I think what I'll do with the bigger pieces, because if I leave them stood up, I've got some bowls I'd like to get in, and they wouldn't go in at the same time. So what I'm going to do probably next is put the shallower bowls in, and then have room to lay the bottles down, the vases down on the top shelf, and fire it like that. But we'll see how we get on. Okay, these are the bowls that I wanted to get in. I've measured the tallest little bottle there, which is about 5 inches tall, a bit under. So I'm going to put 5 supports in to give me that 5 inches clearance up to the next shelf. I've got plenty of tiles I can fill around, but I just need to check if that'll go in. Yeah, it's not absolutely critical where you put the shelf supports, as long as they're reasonably spaced out and providing a reasonable support for the shelf on top. Lower down, again, it's a bit more critical to get one as near the middle as you can because of the weight of the others on top of it. You'll find that people set little challenges for you, like supporting a handle with a piece of paper. The handle's incredibly delicate, the hand now has shrunk around the paper. It's whether I can get that out without damaging the handle. I'm not overly confident, to be honest. It's quite a tight fit at the top there. It's a matter of trying to squeeze it through. Right, let's try and get that in there as well. Because of the handle on that one, I prefer if it could be stood up, but the handle's going to take it a bit too high. So again, very, very carefully, lay that down inside one of the bowls. Bowls are great because you can put things inside them. It's a little bit above the thermocouple sticking through, so that's okay. Just make sure there's a good gap all the way around the shelf. Alright, so the last lot of things are going to go in there, and we'll see how we manage with the bowls. They might actually be too big to even go on the side now, but there are a couple of other pieces that can go in, so we'll see how we get on. Okay, one vase, the body was small enough diameter for it to go in, just about, and the cottage I've managed to get on its side. Large bowls are always a problem because one part of it is going to be close to the elements, and that will heat up. There's no way of getting around that. That will heat up more quickly than the rest of it, so there is always a chance that something wide like that will crack on the edge, and it's really impossible to centre it up on a shelf like this because we just don't have the space to be able to do such small numbers in firing if we were having to centre things into the middle. It'll probably be alright, it's reasonably thick. You can check the height of the other things. Nothing's actually touching the bottom of the tape. Okay, so when the lid comes down it's not going to touch onto anything. There will be a small gap at the top. What I'm going to do now is just fill up this space with tiles again, and I'll just take a quick picture of that before I put it on. Okay, so that's it loaded up. You can see I've got quite a few tiles in the top. I'm reasonably happy with the way it's been done, so there's nothing that's been too delicately passed on top of something else. There's always a chance things will crack during the biscuit fire, but this is going to go on very, very slowly. So again, because it's quite well loaded up, it's going to take a long time for what bit of moisture there's still in the clay to get out. So when I program the controller, I'm going to program it for quite a long fire, so it'll probably take about 14 hours for it to come up to temperature. And I'm probably going to give it about 12 hours to get up to the first sort of 400 or 500 degrees, so that should dry out alright. So putting the lid down, bear in mind that's heavy, you don't want to drop it on top, and take the bung out from the side, and that will allow moisture out. Now, having said that, these top loading kilns, there's quite a few gaps all the way around them. So the chances of moisture getting trapped in a kiln like this are quite slim. The front loaders are different because the moisture rises to the top of the kiln and you need to get it to vent out properly. In this case it's going to vent through all these little gaps all around the top anyway, but I will take that one out, just let the moisture come through there.